A $5 trillion occupation of Afghanistan, $10 trillion occupation in war there in Iraq. They'd have never tolerated any of this if they had to pay for it up front.
On today's episode of Mentor Sessions, we were joined by Scott Horton, the one-man walking encyclopedia. Scott is the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of several books, including Fool's Errand, Enough Already, and Provoked. We asked Scott, how does the fiat money printer hide the true costs of war? How does foreign adventurism leave us both less well-off and less safe here at home? And can Bitcoin fix this? Scott gave us a lot of food for thought on the various disasters our fiat politicians have gotten us into and why they have every incentive to keep pouring gas on the flames. Scott, thank you very much for joining us. We know you're very busy, so we really appreciate your time.
Happy to be here.
Yes, thank you. I think it's safe to say that Nathan and I, along with many other Bitcoiners, are with you on trying to reduce and avoid wars and all of the child maiming and slaughter and the utter waste of money and human blood that comes with that. But since this is a Bitcoin podcast, I'd like to start off with a quote from a man I think we both admire, Ron Paul, who said, quote, "It's no coincidence that the century of total war coincided with the century of central banking." And we often say in Bitcoin circles that, quote unquote, Bitcoin fixes this. Can you enlighten us perhaps on ways that fiat has broken this, so to speak? Who benefits from these undeclared forever wars and general foreign interventionism, and how so? I know that's a lot.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, at the heart of government control of the currency is a big bookkeeping trick, right? It's the central bank is essentially a cartel sort of crony capitalist agreement between the central banks and the government, where the government allows, gives license to the banks to print money, but the banks promise to always buy government debt and to keep each other in business in that way. And so, like if you go to government school and you're one of us unwashed masses out here, we don't own gold. Our families don't own gold. Most of us come from people who work for a living rather than own things for a living out here in the vast majority of people. So the gold standard sounds like it's some way of just guaranteeing that people who are wealthy enough to own gold then somehow control everything. And, they say the golden rule, those who have the gold makes the rules and all that kind of thing. And so I don't know who said it. It may have been Hazlitt or somebody who said that, inflation is a war against all of the people, but not one man in 10,000 understands what is happening to him when, through the process of inflation and the boom bust cycle and the rest of this kind of thing. And so because it's a very complicated type subject, and we're essentially taught that you got to be really rich, or at least in on it somehow, in the banking industry somehow, to even understand this stuff. Maybe go to law school first, but ultimately this is for experts and doesn't really concern you, and sort of obfuscate all of that stuff. And I really should have said too that another part of the scam, the backstop to the scam, is that I guess I'm not skipping a step. That's in the next step. So when they took us off the gold standard, I mean, they had already created the central bank before that. But what that meant was they were expanding the currency over the long term enough that they couldn't pretend to back it up in gold anymore. So that was where they just cut the gold standard. So now it's just the IRS standard. And people say it's the oil standard and stuff like that. There's a bit of that with the global petrodollar and all that. But what it really is the IRS promises to tax the American people enough to pay interest to the bondholders. And so that it's the U.S. treasuries that are the security that back up the actual national currency. But the real point being that the problem with the gold standard from the point of view of the people with especially state power, but even of course, they're partners in big business and crime, is that it limits how much money they can create and expand to spend. And so, ultimately gold and silver are inflationary in the sense that you can always mine more and introduce more into circulation, but there's a limit on that, and it takes real effort and capital investment in order to dig up that new gold and silver and introduce it into the currency, or into the broader economy and that kind of thing. So there's a break on it. But if you want to remake the world, then that's going to cost a lot of money, and so you're going to have to wage a World War II, and there's no way that you can essentially, just on the face of it, what they would have to do is just raise taxes and force the American people to pay essentially up front, or barring that, if you grew up in my Generation X era, watching Bugs Bunny cartoons, buy war bonds in order to help the United States government. That's, a bit of debt to help the government afford to pay for the war, but then they'll pay you back once them Germans are defeated again, And so, but with a central banking system and this cartel system where the government and the banks help each other create new currency all the time, then that means that of their three options, raising taxes, borrowing, or printing the money, they now have the easiest for them of the three. Because when you print the money, you're essentially taxing people by devaluing their currency in their pocket. But again, without 1 in 10,000 men understanding what's happening to them or why, who's taking his wealth and running off with it, and how it works. And so, and the price is delayed. So if you think back to W. Bush's war in Iraq, where he essentially was in a conspiracy with Alan Greenspan to lower interest rates down to zero. And this is right after, and we were due for a recession anyway. You might remember, if you're old enough, that when W. Bush came in 2001, he said, "It's the Clinton recession. I just got here. Don't you call it the W. Bush thing, man. I just got here. It's the Clinton recession."
Yeah, right.
We've had the crashes in the NASDAQ and the stock market, and now we're just trying to reinflate the housing bubble again. So give me some time, right? And then September 11th hit, where they hijacked the airlines, which are some of the biggest and most expensive and capital intensive, biggest businesses in America. And then they crashed into the financial district in downtown New York. So we were all set for what they call a double dip recession right there, just because we took one on the damn chin that day, right? And that should have hurt. But instead, they cranked the money machine on full blast. And that meant not only did they say, go out and spend money, go into debt, buy a new car, buy a new house, buy new countertops for the house you already have, and all of these things, go on vacation. And not only that, we're going to go to Afghanistan. And not only that, we're going to go to Iraq too. And not only that, but we're going to send all IRS taxpayers an either $200 or $300 check in the mail. And that would be, they didn't exactly call it this, but the implication clearly was, and if you listen to talk radio audiences discuss it, the idea clearly was, this was their dividend from the profit we were all making off of invading Iraq. When, of course, we weren't making profit off of invading Iraq at all. They're blowing $10 trillion. Yeah. All that money was being printed and being wasted, blown into the sand, and high velocity explosions tearing lives and property apart over there. But they were able to do that in order to make people feel like, I'm in on this. See, our way of life depends on, we have to wage war all the time. You know what they say? And they do say this, war's good for the economy, but that's really not true at all, right? If you just think about it on the basic level, you're talking about wealth that could go into capital investment to supply goods and services to human beings to increase their standard of living, right? Or it goes into making weapons of war that simply destroy lives and property, a net loss for everyone. And then you can't even use the jets for some other civilian purpose. They're 1- and 2-seater planes, right? C-130s have no civilian uses, even in like heavy cargo lifting or whatever. So when they retire the C-130s, what do they do? Dump them in the ocean or something? I don't know. But they're not put to any civilian use. Hardly any of the military stuff is. So, if you're in on it and you own Lockheed stock, then, and that's just one major example because they're the top arms industrial firm, but it's the same for the banks that service all these transactions as well. This is essentially a direct welfare payment to you. And, there's no irony when conservatives talk about welfare for the poor, but libertarians see through all this, that once you're wealthy enough, all of a sudden there's no shame whatsoever in cashing a massive government check to subsidize whatever you're doing, to hire a congressman to regulate your competition out of business, or to engage in any act of statism and especially grand theft out of the treasury at the expense of your fellow man in order to keep the whole thing going. And that's exactly how they operate. And so, sorry for bloviating, but point being that the American people might have paid to send the special operations forces to Tora Bora to actually kill Osama bin Laden instead of helping him escape or letting him escape. They would not have volunteered to pay in increased taxes on demand for a $5 trillion occupation for 20 years of Afghanistan and a $10 trillion occupation in war for 8 to 10 years there in Iraq, and then on to Libya and Syria and the rest. They'd have never tolerated any of this if they had to pay for it up front. And so by abandoning the gold standard and a limit on money creation, they essentially wrote their own blank check for world empire. And the problem is, of course, now, as everyone can see, and you know what? This is like with Joe Biden being too old to run for president. I used to like to say for about 4 years there or more, once he got out of his basement, that it really doesn't matter who you are, right? Like you could be anyone's absolutely, completely politically ignorant old auntie who doesn't know anything about politics other than we have a president and elections sometimes, right? And she can take one look at Biden and tell you, oh yeah, no, he's too old for this. He can't possibly be the one making the decisions, or at least not most of them. And this kind of thing. It's the same kind of thing with all of the wars. Is anyone could tell you that all of this is so expensive, we'd have never volunteered to pay for it up front if they had come to us with the bill and said, this is what it's going to cost you. And then when you hear on the news, anyone's old auntie who knows nothing about politics could hear on the news that when the Congress and the Treasury pay the interest on the national debt now, that the interest on the national debt is more than we spend on militarism every year. Not just the Pentagon budget, but it's even up to like $2 trillion a year, when the real militarist budget is $1.7 trillion. And that's as calculated by Winslow Wheeler. They say the official Pentagon budget is about 800 to 900 billion, but there's the care and feeding of the nuclear weapons. There's all the guys laid up in the VA, Walter Reed and the rest of it. I don't think this includes servicing the previous debt. This is just whatever the black budgets for the intelligence agencies and the rest. You can read, if anyone just types in 1.7 trillion, Andrew Coburn and Winslow Wheeler, you'll find it, where Andrew Coburn just wrote this up and he has Winslow Wheeler's great chart of all the spending. So that's 1.7 trillion a year that we're spending on militarism. And then we're spending even more than that just to pay the interest on the debt that we ran up for all the previous militarism. And so anyone could tell you, anyone's little old auntie who doesn't know anything really about politics at all could say that, geez, like Joe Biden in office, this is just not sustainable. It just cannot be that this is the way that we operate. We can't afford it. And imagine, and you guys don't have to imagine, you're living this, your entire audience is living this. Think of every dime you've ever paid into the general fund that they have, taken out straight out of your paycheck. There's a great article by Thomas Edlam on the Libertarian Institute site today about how payroll taxes for working men and women are higher than the capital gains taxes for people who already have wealth and are just earning off of capital gains. And it's a much bigger portion, obviously for working people of their total budget as well, when affording the basic necessities like a warm place to sleep and food for their kids and all of that is such a higher proportion of their income and, their total revenue coming in the first place. And how was I going to finish that sentence? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, not at all, man.
But anyway, just, point being that whatever, I forgot exactly what I was going to say, but I'll just say, like, it's clear as day that the regular people in this country are being absolutely gangsterized by a ruling class, a population of people in control of political power and economic power in this country who just absolutely hate our guts and would just as soon see us all dead, I guess, and who have no problem, by the way, and this is, I should have mentioned this, I kind of alluded to it, but I should have really elaborated about this as well, earlier in my rambling rant here, that the inflationary monetary system, it doesn't just cause this widespread price inflation across the board, as we see in our prices on the shelves, our price of cars, our price of eggs, and our price of in rent and mortgages and everything like we have now. It's a huge consequence of, yes, Trump and then Biden's massive spending to make up for their deliberate crashing of the economy in the COVID lockdowns. That's something that hasn't been seen in the country, this sort of widespread overall price inflation, like in this very noticeable, immediate kind of way since the 70s. Instead, what we've usually had is bubbles in major sectors like fuel and housing and food, yes, but where prices stay somewhat the same. W. Bush years are a great example of this, and really Obama years too. There's not overall too much price inflation on the shelves, but you have these huge booms and then these busts. At the time of the lockdown bust, we were due for one anyway. So that was just a great way of liquidating a bunch of bad bets out of the system and bad loans out of the system. But then what they do, they just injected trillions of more dollars of phony new money right back in again. So, you know, this is the thing, again, where it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you have any political savvy or education whatsoever. You've lived through the boom and bust your whole life. Sometimes the economy's good. Sometimes it completely sucks. Nobody's making money and nobody's trading anything. And nobody can understand why. Nobody understands what's really happening to them. And of course, the way TV portrays it is the economy was great and then it started sucking real bad. And only the Austrian school, not even the Chicago school or the monetarists or whoever, only the Austrian school can explain that. No. When the economy's great, it's not. When the economy's great, because of our monetary system, it's always a phony prosperity. Now, there's some obvious real, increases in production going on, but never enough to make up for the new money being created. Every time a business takes out a loan, it's brand new money entering the system. And so that means that whenever it's good times, they are artificially good, above what they otherwise would be. And then here comes the crash. And it happens every single time, the very real crash that just causes people absolutely to suffer, where businesses that were otherwise prosperous and reasonable businesses in a slowly growing and prosperous economy would have been okay. But they're close enough to the margin, they get destroyed in the very real crash that comes from the artificial boom. So you have companies like the entire restaurants built around just cupcakes, that those are purely bubble activity. They're going to cease to exist when the crash comes. But then you have otherwise good businesses, well-founded and well-grounded and well-run businesses that also get destroyed on the margin because they stuck their neck out too far, servicing companies like the Cupcake Factory and all of that. And the Austrians explain this so well. I'm no real economist. I just basically know the case that when it comes to the higher order goods, meaning like if your business is digging granite out of the ground and bringing it to market, your time horizons are really long. You take out long-term loans to buy incredibly expensive pieces of equipment and to pay armies of men to work their asses off, sometimes for years before you're actually turning your product around and bringing it to market in a way that you get your payoff, right? So these are the kind of businesses that have these very long time horizons, right? Low time preferences, as we call them. But then what happens is when the interest rates are artificially low, they end up finding out too late that we're not going to be able to pay these off over the long term in time. We're not going to make our profit and have our cushion by the time these loans come due. And especially if they're on some variable rates where now their payments on their debt are way too high and they go out of business. And then even if your quarry is run by an Austrian who absolutely understands the scam here and how this works,
he doesn't have the incentive.
Still in competition with other quarries, and they are buying new equipment and hiring new guys and increasing their productivity. So they're going to beat your pants off in the short term if you don't make what you even know is the same bad bet that they're making over the long term. And so even companies that know better are induced into creating the same kinds of errors. And this is what Mises, Ludwig von Mises, called the cluster of errors. Says you could have all kinds of things happen to an economy, right? There's a huge frost in Florida, and so the value of oranges goes way up, and because so many oranges were decimated in their crop, or there's a hurricane in the Gulf, or a tornado in Kansas, or whatever. All kinds of things can happen. But what causes all these businesses to all make the same bad bet at the same time, that now's a good time to take out a loan that actually they're going to end up getting stuck with their pants down, or, stuck without a chair when the music stops, or however you'd like to say it. And that is, it's the boom and bust. It's the artificially low interest rates that make it easier for the government and the banks to create new money, creating that artificial boom, and then leaving everybody high and dry. And then it just is a coincidence, I guess, guys, that it's all regular people, upstart businesses, landowners, farmers, people like that who lose everything. And the people who own the stock and the biggest banks and all of that are the ones who end up running off with everybody's stuff, right? Like everybody knows this is, if you think about it, you already know that this is what happened to the farmers, right? You got Willie Nelson up there singing Farm Aid, but what happened, right? Well, they jacked the interest rates way, way down. And then encourage all these farmers to take out new loans. You need computers. You need new tractors. You need all this massive capital investment into your great-grandfather's farm. Oops. Now Paul Volcker just ratcheted your interest rate up to 25% because he's got to stop the inflation that those artificially low interest rates cause. And so now, sorry, we're taking your great-grandfather's farm. Good luck, with your militia. And then that, and this happens over and over and over again. It happens with the .com stuff. Sure, there was a bunch of vaporware, but there are also a lot of really great companies that had some really great talent and really great ideas and so-called intellectual property that all got bought up for pennies once the crash came, in things that would have been much more profitable if they'd been able to hang on over a longer term. So, in other words, real capitalists hate our current system because it's a complete corrupt perversion of how free market economics are supposed to work, starting with the monetary system and then on down from there. So how's that for my first half-hour answer to what bothers me about our money now?
I mean, you had me at cupcakes. I spent the last 5 minutes thinking about that. But it's great. I feel like we could just wind you up and off you go. And this makes Nathan and my job very easy.
And I'm basically on topic, right?
Yeah, no, pretty much.
This is how we make the wars seem free when they're not.
Right. And there's something that you mentioned there that I kind of tied into this recurring. There's a few things. One, the idea that all these business cycles are synchronizing up at the same time is a direct result of screwing with the underlying communication method, screwing with the price signals directly in money. It should never be that way. There's no reason that a downfall in one industry because of a technological breakthrough or some sort of catastrophic event should necessarily affect the rest of the economy. But one thing that I was thinking about there was this idea of how these things continue to perpetuate in the kind of sickest sort of reinforcing cycle. Because as soon as you're talking about just our average guys, our average plebs here getting hurt with this constant debasing of the currency and the resulting crashes that happen of it, it's all right, that would also then probably result in enlistments going up as well too. Meaning that, and if we look at it from the war machine, you got the war, we give some excuse that allows us to then print money and debase the currency. The debasing of the currency is then, as a result, destroying the economy and productive activities that people were doing are then suffering as a direct result. They necessarily then they may be a young man who is starting a business who just got absolutely ruined, who has nowhere to turn. So then he might then want someone to go and then enlist in order to try and make ends meet. And the cycle just continues to perpetuate over and over again. Yep. Where not only are they stealing from you, but they're putting you in such a desperate situation that they're forcing you then to maybe end your life or put your life on the line for a war that didn't make sense in the first place.
Yep. And, they call it the economic draft. And, libertarians and even conservatives are good at thinking about stuff like this when it comes to other subjects, but sometimes don't want to apply it to things like this. But look at even the GI Bill. Well, these guys come home from the Second World War and we go, well, look, man, you guys, damn near made the ultimate sacrifice. Welcome back home. But so look, I mean, it's only fair, right? That the Uncle Sam should pay for you to go to college, and so that you can have a successful and prosperous life now after, you've risked so much for the rest of us, whatever. But what does that mean in real life? It's just like paying a single mother for being a single mother. You're paying her to be a single mother, right? So now they've created a situation where this is how working class people go to college. Yeah. You got to go join the national government's military first, and then you get to go to college. Where people would have figured out another way, and maybe it wouldn't have help to inflate the price of college so
I'll say if
high that you
government's
need
flipping
the
the
government
bill,
to
they're just
help
gonna drive
pay
it
for
up.
you to go anyway, you know? And then, you know, part of this too is we live in the Democrats' world. So like, you know, I was saying before about this cliche, people really believe this. War is good for the economy. But in what sense? Yeah, like if you go to a government school and listen to their economists tell you what really matters is aggregate demand. So if the government is bidding up prices of, say, metal so they can make war machines, then and they're going into debt and they're inflating the currency in order to buy more metal to make war machines out of, well, the number's going up. So what are you quibbling about? Right? Even though this is all to the detriment of the actual gross domestic product of what would be helping people improve their standard of living in the country, which is what ought to be the measure, right? But they go, no, see, look, aggregate demand. And then even worse. And I swear, like you couldn't make this stuff up. It could be, you know, in the Onion or the Israeli bee, whatever they call it now.
The Babylon Bee.
The Likudnik bee.
Yeah.
Where they go, hey, look, in the Second World War, the unemployment rate went way down.
Yeah.
Because we conscripted 16 million men and shipped them overseas.
Slave labor, full employment.
Yeah, and then they put a cap on wages anyway, right? So yeah, you couldn't even get a cost of living increase even when the demand for labor was way up anyway. And they go, oh yeah, but that's what saved the economy, was conscripting all those people and getting 450,000 of them killed in war and converting all of that metal and gunpowder to, you know, offensive purposes. Yeah, to imperial purposes.
If you're enjoying this interview with Scott Horton so far, please do push that like button. It really does help the channel get more Bitcoin content in front of a wider audience. And now a quick message from this episode's sponsors.
Are you ready to mine Bitcoin like the pros? Blockware offers everything you need: top-tier mining rigs, reliable hosting in US facilities, and even a mining pool with low fees and flexible payouts. Their marketplace lets you buy miners with zero lead time and sell time, giving you ultimate flexibility and a way to capitalize on hardware price volatility. Plus, with Blockware Intelligence, you'll stay ahead of the game with expert research and insights. Don't just stack Bitcoin, mine it. Click the link in the show notes or scan the QR code on the screen to get started today. Bitcoin Well is the best place to be buying and selling Bitcoin in Canada and the US. And now with Bitcoin Well Infinite, it's also the best place to be making large buys at their OTC desk of over $50,000. Their white glove service gives you fast transactions, no slippage, and the lowest fees. You can scan the QR code on the screen or simply head to bitcoinwell.com/BTC sessions to sign up today. And you can share your own personalized referral link to earn commissions.
One thing I'm kind of curious about, Scott, here, and maybe you have some insight in this and maybe you don't too. So it seems to me, if I'm looking at the people that are pushing these kind of narratives forward, that are pushing for conflict, pushing for war, we've got basically weapons manufacturers, and it's another reason to continue to print and debase and spend where they want to, as well as it hopefully can just kind of align public sentiment behind them. So there's kind of like a power and a money incentive there I can see on that side for them to push it forward. I'm curious if there's any other kind of incentives or things going on that people are profiting or gaining some sort of influence as a result of pushing these narratives. And in particular, what I was thinking about recently was that conversation with Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office, and then he went to Europe, and then Europe seemed that like they're going to back him. Well, I could be wrong on this, but as far as I know, it seems like a lot of the weapons manufacturing is kind of stateside. I'm not sure how Europe is in terms of weapons manufacturing, but I actually don't know what necessarily. Well, like what's the UK's incentive in continuing this conflict in Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think they're going to, because I agree with you that they don't have the capacity to do it. And they know they can't. You know, they had their meeting in France and in Paris there, and they, at the end, they said, well, of course, you know, we would need America to backstop our security guarantees. Yeah. In other words, you don't have any security guarantees to give. Yeah,
it's like promising your big brother will beat him up. It's like, you got nothing to offer, dude.
Right. Yeah, but but Big Brother's already gone home, right? He's already decided he's not going to do this. So, I think, you know, in libertarianism, and I keep saying this, I really do need to read some books about this and stuff. I only like kind of barely know of it, but it's this is not the root and branch of all things libertarian, but it's part of libertarian economic analysis, is called public choice theory.
Yep.
And it means essentially that there is no real national interest. There's just the interest of the people involved. I was just reading earlier today, Daryl Cooper had a thing about how at Versailles, after World War I, the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, actually was not really as vindictive at heart as the French were, but he was running for re-election that year. And they had just told everybody that the Kaiser was Hitler, although Hitler hadn't been invented yet. They were, in fact, in the middle of inventing him. But they had demonized the Kaiser so badly that now they couldn't be seen as being conciliatory at all, even after the Kaiser was gone and they were actually making peace with the so-called liberal Democrats who had taken power, after the fall of the Kaiser's regime. And so he had to be tough for his own interests, even though he felt better and knew better than to do it. He did that anyway. And that's just one example from my readings this morning, but it happens all the time, right? And so what's going on here is, well, Donald Trump is the uncouth right-wing extremist Donald Trump. And so that means that all the good liberal Democrats of Europe have to posture as the Joe Bidens of the situation and as the hero for their own domestic political needs. But then they're up against the same reality we're already discussing, which is, what are they going to do about it? Nothing. The British and the Germans and the Poles and the French all together don't have a land army enough to truly intervene in Ukraine. And they're not willing to do it for the same reason America's not willing to do it, because that would mean real war with the Russian Federation. And they're just not going to do that because the Russian Federation's sitting on 7,000 H-bombs. So it is what it is. 1,500 deployed, but that'll be enough for you. Right. So I think the thing, ultimately it'll come to an end, but this was, and part of the answer to your question then too is, if we leave out the Europeans for a moment, and this is part of their problem, their politics and their identity, as I was just saying, but I'm more familiar, I guess, at least with the Americans and certainly with Joe Biden and how we got into this mess. And you can absolutely see the ideology of American empire at work here, where they know that they're the good guys and therefore anyone who opposes them are the bad guys, that anything is worth doing if it will help to hurt the bad guys. And so, especially with cranky old Joe Biden, who is so out of his depth by the time that all this was happening on his watch, he could not really get interested and pay close attention to the details and really understand what was going on in any kind of real sense. And that was why everything out of his mouth was some kind of stupid historical analogy to World War II. Putin's Hitler and I'm Churchill. And what you do with a bully is you stand up to him. And then that's it. Right? So we're like Christopher Reeve Superman, the virgin Boy Scout, choir boy, whatever, out to maybe Gabriel, the archangel, out to protect humanity from itself. And then these obstructors and terrorists and tyrants and evil men stand in our way of doing the right thing. And I mean, there's strains of this going back to the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, all the way back to then, where the shining city on the hill, as soon as possible, will be a laser designator, directing a bomb to our enemies who stand in the way of true progress. And
I got to interrupt you there, Scott, because I'm curious, and I know it's way too much to maybe get into, but I think it's worth I'm sure some of the audience is already aware, but I'd love for you even just to hit some key points on talking about U.S. good guy, Russia bad guy kind of situation set up here. Could you even just lightly touch on some of the events prior to the invasion of Ukraine that the U.S. was directly involved in, quoting your book, provoked them into the situation, and how they had a hand in actually escalating this conflict in the first place?
Sure. I mean, the major points of contention were ongoing NATO expansion to the east and the avowed impending incorporation of Ukraine into the NATO alliance, as well as the ongoing civil war in the east of the country, where the West was backed by the United States and the east by the Russians. And that had been going on since March of 2014 in the aftermath of, they always say this, ever since Russia just took Crimea. When, no, actually the history of 2014 begins a couple of months before that. And in fact, most salient point being just a few days before that, when America and their allies on the ground succeeded in overthrowing the government there and installing a new anti-Russian regime in Kiev, which is what led to the seizure of Crimea.
Colored
Go
revolution?
ahead,
Never.
Gary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gary,
Oh,
yeah.
no, stop making sense. No, please. Whatever.
Yeah. So, but that's the way they tell the story, of course. Yeah. And so that was when the war broke out, was, I think, in overreaction after the Russians seized Crimea. They said, well, we can't just let them walk right into eastern Ukraine. So which they really had no intention to at the time. But when they did, I guess, intend on destabilizing the country and preventing them from consolidating power under the new government. But when local demonstrators, essentially, there were Russians involved, but they really came to get ahead of the parade later on. And I show that in the timeline in the book there. But when the local demonstrators came and seized buildings in the east and said, well, if you guys can seize buildings and overthrow the government, we can seize buildings and refuse to recognize your authority over our parts of the country there. And at that time, they'd committed no act of war. The worst thing that they had done was seize the National Police buildings and just occupy them. And then John Brennan, and everybody can read this in USA Today and in Forbes magazine from April the 12th through 14th there, that John Brennan, the head of the CIA, the same guy who had backed al-Qaeda in Syria until it blew up into the caliphate, the same guy who later framed Trump for treason with Russia, he went to Kiev and demanded that they launch the war on behalf of Barack Obama. And so they launched what they called an anti-terrorist operation that started this 7-year-long war in the East. And they had a pseudo peace deal that never got fully implemented, but that reduced the war from its worst tempo to what they call lower level fighting, which is still, so it was like 9,000 people killed in the first, say, 10 or 11 months, and then another 4,000 people killed in the 7 years after that. So still people getting blown up, but on a much lower rate. And yet the peace deal that America's allies had forged with, that's Germany and France, had forged with the Russians and had been rubber stamped by Obama and by the UN Security Council, the Minsk I and Minsk II peace deals, they were never implemented. And that was because the Ukrainians, not the Russians, the Ukrainians refused to implement the thing in order and said, actually, no, we changed it from we're going to hold new elections and then rewrite our constitution to guarantee neutrality and all of these things to actually, no, we're going to take control of the entire east of the country, and including all of the border posts on the Ukrainian-Russian border first. In other words, the rebels, and with whatever Russian advisors and help they had at that time, which was much less than after 22 for sure, that they would have to completely quit the field and concede entire defeat to Kiev and then hold their elections. And Kiev was saying, well, you can't have an election under occupation, but yeah, same thing from the other direction too. Can't have a free election under their occupation either. And so they weren't willing to accept that. And then whenever the Europeans tried to get this thing implemented, the Americans obstructed it. And this included under Trump the first time, the ambassador William Taylor prevented the new President Zelensky in 2019 from signing on to a German formula for implementing sort of a new order of operations that was a compromise to get everybody to implement the Minsk II deal. So this ongoing war in the East, and you had the ultimate threat of the full integration of Ukraine into the NATO alliance, and it was a de facto membership. They were clearly not ready to give an Article 5 guarantee and full membership to Ukraine, but they were increasing what they called interoperability with their military. In other words, standardizing their weapon systems, their command and control and communications and everything else, so that in essence, they were a member of NATO anyway, in the question of, like, in the hypothetical of if the Russian Federation and NATO went to war, Ukraine would be just another auxiliary army under American Supreme Allied Command running NATO, along with Hungary and the Baltics and the Czech Republic and Germany and the rest. And so the Russians had made it clear forever before that this is an absolutely intolerable situation. And what it really came down to was, because, Biden was very involved in Eastern European policy the whole post-Cold War era long. And he knew he couldn't really bring Ukraine into NATO. There are other members, especially Hungary, would veto it, but I think other members would also not allow it. And just the basic rules would not allow it. The country's
just for the
far too
risk
corrupt.
of triggering like Article 5, and they didn't want to have that possible.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they have an ongoing border dispute over who controls Crimea, as Putin put it numerous times in the run-up to the war. Well, I say Crimea is mine. I've owned it de facto and de jure since 2014 again. But Ukraine and the West refuse to recognize that and say, no, it's Ukrainian soil occupied illegally by Russia, which means that if Ukraine joins NATO and Ukraine attacks Russian positions in Crimea and Russia defends, you're going to call that aggression. And so we could have a war right there. That could trigger Article 5, and we'd have a war right there between NATO and the Russian Federation over Crimea. And so this is exactly why you cannot join our alliance if you have an ongoing border dispute. And if you look at them in the news, there were reports of this in the last year where they talk about, well, we'll just have to waive that in the case of Ukraine. Yeah, no, you can't, and you won't waive that because it would mean war. And almost certainly there's virtually no circumstance, no war game where America and NATO go to war against Russia and it does not turn into a nuclear war. And there's virtually no war game. And people should know this. There's virtually no war game. And this is somewhat disputed, but I've got one real expert who disputes this and 1,000 who say that in every experiment that they've run, if we go to war with Russia, it turns into general nuclear war and we lose every major city in the northern half of the world, right? That's the northernmost quarter of it or third of it, where the entire United States, Europe, and Russia are wiped off the face of the earth in a day or two. And there's essentially no way to ramp it down from there. Use them or lose them is the doctrine. Once the thing kicks off, even with the smallest of atom bombs in the battlefield, everything gets ratcheted up from there until we're using city killers. That's just, and even Joe Biden said, look, we're not putting our American forces in there no matter what, because that would be World War III. And we're not going to do that. We'll help the Ukrainians fight. We'll get them into this fight and we'll give them weapons, but we won't do anything to actually help them.
And it's funny. I kind of want to touch on that for a second
Sure.
as well, too, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm curious your opinion on this. From the little information that I have, I can't see a winning scenario for Ukraine without necessarily having U.S. troops on the ground. And we're never going to put U.S. troops on the ground because then we're looking at like complete nuclear winter and Holocaust.
Right.
Say never.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah. Let's not test that one. And then I apologize, Gary. I'll let you ask the question, but I'm really enjoying the conversation. Is there any viable path for Ukraine to succeed here? Because all I can see is kind of like slow bleed and eventually give up. Like it's just short or long. There's no win.
Right. And so back to that in one moment, but just to wrap up what I should have wrapped up 5 minutes ago, which is Biden's
keep going.
policy. Biden said repeatedly, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO now, not for the next 10 years. However, we have a policy called the open door policy. And the open door policy says that you can't say that we can't bring NATO in. We will never bow down and appease a Hitlerian who demands that we take their security concerns into account. We will decide who joins our alliance. No one else has a say in it. And for that high principle, we are willing to push Ukraine into a war that we know they will lose with Russia. And the goal then will be, just as you just said, we know they couldn't win the whole time. We knew they couldn't win. CIA said they knew they couldn't win. They thought they'd lose right away. They knew all along they couldn't win over the long term. But as they put it, we don't want, this is April 4th, 2002. In the Washington Post. Americans and Eastern European NATO states don't want to see the war end too quickly. They want to see the war drag on until they can inflict enough of what they consider a strategic defeat on Russia that they'll never try this again. And they were absolutely blatant about this in the New York Times and the rest. Neil Ferguson wrote in Bloomberg that everybody who's anybody in DC or in London knows that this is the plan, to prolong the war, to scotch peace efforts and to keep the thing going as long as possible. After the war started, Ukraine went to come to the table and what's known as, ultimately what became the Istanbul Agreement. And with the actual productive intervention of the Israeli prime minister, who had the trust of both sides, Naftali Bennett, not Benjamin Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett at the time, who was a war criminal and actually caused the September 11th attack by bombing a UN shelter full of women and children in Qana, Lebanon in 1996 and inspiring the Hamburg cell of hijackers to go volunteer for bin Laden. Same guy. Anyway, he had helped to negotiate to get the ball rolling on this negotiation, and they were making real progress. And then Biden let it be known through Boris Johnson that America and Britain will not support you at all if you try to make peace with Russia now. And so gave them, and they should have said, well, screw you then, because we don't need your support that bad if we're at peace. So we might as well sign it. And they made the very bad call to trust the Americans and to continue to fight. And so, and they've done nothing but lose since right around then. The high water mark of their war was in September of 22. This is the weekend of September 11th of 22. So this is what, 6-8 months into the war, whatever it is. And they made this brilliant feint and ended up making major progress in Kharkiv Oblast and in Kherson down in the south. And they essentially kicked the Russians all the way out of Kharkiv and all the way into Luhansk. And then in Kherson, they essentially retook half the province and forced the Russians to the south and east side of the river there. At that point, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, and the then current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, both said, okay, you boys should come to the table right now and quit while you're only this far behind. It's all downhill from here, right? Because he had the intel. He knew the Russians are pouring in more and more men, more and more equipment, and they're able to build better and better and layered defensive positions. They're not going anywhere. And the land that they're taking, they're reinforcing severely. So the more land you lose, the more land you're never getting back here. So you should negotiate now. And we all knew what happened then. And now we have the ultimate confirmation of it all in the outgoing Antony Blinken article in the New York Times that just came out before the transfer of power 2 months ago. It's called Secretary of War. And it's about the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and how he outmaneuvered the military men to keep the war going. And I guess the Secretary of Defense was just, Austin was just a non-issue in this stuff. And it was Blinken, and Blinken had been Joe Biden's right-hand man for 30 years, right? Like he was a big part of everything that Biden ever got wrong his whole life, or for the last generation and more. And so he was the one who, I mean, just like you can make it up, right? Yeah, the State Department weenies overruled the warriors and said, you don't know what you're talking about. And if you remember, in the later part of 22, they said, well, we're going to launch this massive winter offensive. Once the ground freezes solid and therefore the mud is no longer a problem from the autumn, wet, cold rains. But once that ground freezes, we're going to send the tanks and we're going to have this massive offensive against the Russians. It's going to bust their chops. But then they had kind of a mild winter and the ground never did freeze. So the winter offensive became the spring offensive. But then, boy, did they have a wet and cold, but not cold enough spring. And so it's just nothing but more mud. And so we'll have to put it off and put it off and put it off until it became the summer offensive of 2023, when the mud finally dried up and they could try to make their break down in Zaporozhye, which is, sort of the Azov coast province there between Crimea and Russia. And they got like 6 kilometers or whatever all summer long. They essentially retook nothing and blew their whole wad. Massive armored divisions that had been armed up and trained in Germany by the United States and the Allies were destroyed in an afternoon. The whole thing was an absolute debacle and catastrophe. And then that was, 2 years ago almost, a year and a half ago. And more. And it's been all downhill for them since then. And you've had, I don't know what the real casualties are. Both sides claim inflated numbers for the other side and minimized numbers for their own. I tend to prefer conservative estimates of all of this, but it's at minimum, more than 100,000 men on both sides killed, and then hundreds of thousands of casualties overall. in the war. And you know, I guess I'll add that, you know, military experts like Daniel L. Davis, who I really trust his judgment on so much of this stuff. He says, you know, you see the Russians making incremental progress on the ground, seizing this town and then this town and then this town as they move. But he says, that's not really their strategy, just taking land and taking land and taking land. What they're really doing is just grinding the Ukrainian military to dust, to the point where then they'll just be able to walk around and go wherever they want and take what they want, or at least they'll only be facing much less well-organized insurgency rather than taking on a state military power, and that the Ukrainian forces are just being broken. And we know that they have more than 100,000. These are all from the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal reporting here. We got more than 100,000 people going AWOL, including guys drowning trying to swim across the river to Moldova and stuff like this to get out of there. We have, as everybody's seen, the footage of the press gangs kidnapping guys off the street and conscripting them into the army. A lot of people don't know this. You see footage of older men on the front lines, and people think, oh my God, they already ran out of young men, and now they're resorting to putting 45-year-olds out there. But actually, that's not right. They were resorting to putting 45-year-olds out there in the first place, despite their diabetes and their bad knee and their beer gut and everything else, because they have so few reproduction age males. Wow. That they're holding them in reserve, hoping they can get somebody pregnant before they go out there and get killed. And, you know, so they're holding back their people in the first half of their 20s as long as possible. And I'm not even conscripting them. Draft age is 25. And then, but for the 25 to 30 or 35-year-olds, they're holding them in the rear, doing logistics and basic running of the war, and they're pushing the older men to the front to get blown up because they're already, I guess, useless eaters from the point of view of the state, no longer reproduction age or much less likely to make more children. So they're the ones who have to go out there and fight, which leads to these ridiculous scenes. Again, we're like, you couldn't make this stuff up if you were lying about it. I'd be like, shut up. You can't lie about stuff like that. No. But like, no, where you have Lindsey Graham go over there stomping his foot and demanding that they lower their conscription age from 25 to 18. And they put those 18-year-old boys on the front. How in the hell do you expect to win this war if you don't take the last of your youth and expend them, smashing them up against the Russian rocks here, where they're going to get nowhere anyway? And when this nation is entirely in demographic collapse. But Lindsey Graham doesn't give a damn about that, about their medium-term future, much less their long-term future. They've already had millions of people flee the country, and we're already in a demographic crisis anyway, due mostly to their mismanaged economy from all the corruption in their economy and the rest. And so this war has just been a just absolute debacle for the nation of Ukraine. It's and it, you know, the war party all wants to blame this on Donald Trump. You know, Bill Kristol and David Frum and all these old war hawks from the last few wars say, oh, yeah, sure, pull the rug out from under our guys and snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The jaws of victory? What a lie. I mean, this is what they said about Vietnam. Oh, we were about to win until the liberals stabbed us in the back. Yeah, now it's the liberals saying that about the right. But it's just absolutely ridiculous for anyone who knows anything about what's actually happening on the ground there. Oh, yeah, the Viet Cong were all about to give up, huh? Yeah. And let a bunch of white, foreign-backed and Catholics rule over their country in a right-wing totalitarian state, were they? No. They were going to embrace a left-wing totalitarian state to rid their peninsula of us. Thank you very much, which is exactly how the war ended after 15 years over there. Yeah. And same thing here. Anybody who's not a liar can see the writing on the wall here and has this whole time. And Ukrainians, for their part, I mean, they fought hard as hell and bravely and all that, but they're just on the losing side. Yeah. They just had no capacity to pull this off. And so they should have absolutely never let the Americans get them into this. You know, there's the famous quote from Henry Kissinger, who said, to be America's enemy is dangerous. To be America's friend is fatal. Yeah. And this is what he was talking about, that we will prop you up, and then stab you in the back, which he was happy to do for example, stabbing the Kurds in the back under Richard Nixon and turning them over to the tender mercies of the Iraqis, or was it the Iranians? I forget that anecdote. There's so many of them. America betrays the Kurds every 10 or 15 years. The Kurds here, there, or the other place. And Kissinger had certainly done his betrayal, had participated in the betrayal. Although, what was he supposed to do? This was the right thing to do, was to leave Southeast Asia. But what that meant, of course, was leaving, for one example, for two examples, all the right wingers who sided with us in the South, but also the Hmong tribesmen who were their own separate enemy of the North Vietnamese communists, who the CIA had backed in their death squads and all this Operation Phoenix and all this stuff. All those people got left high and dry. Good luck, Hmong tribesmen of the highlands. Hope the commies don't treat you too roughly. We're out of here. Yeah. And the same kind of thing here. Same thing in Afghanistan. Try to create a coalition regime of the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras to rule over the Pashtuns. Well, but the Pashtuns are the plurality of the country, and they like to fight, and they're not going to give in to this. Guess what? 20 years later, as Colonel McGregor says, time wins more arguments than reason. The Pashtuns walked right into Kabul, and there was no stopping them without sending another 75,000 men to start the war all goddamn over again. And so there was no way they're going to do that. So guess what? Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks, good luck. This is what happens when you trust Uncle Sam. He's a son of a bitch, and he doesn't actually care about you or what happens to you, right?
Scott.
And so this is the same thing that's going to happen to the Ukrainians now. Their country got wrecked because they listened to Joe Biden promising we got your back. Man, you should have known better than that.
Scott, if I may, and I'm saying this because I could seriously just sit here and listen to you all day. I've listened to your audiobook enough already, and I listened to you on the podcasts. I'd like to try to bring this back into possibly what, if anything, we can do about it, because we're sitting here saying all these horrific things are happening to all these horrific people and I look every day on social media and I see Gazan kids just getting shredded, blown up, maimed, orphaned. And for, in the Middle East for 60, 70 years, this has been going on both sides, Arab, Palestinian, Muslim kids and Jewish kids as well. And I just hate seeing kids get slaughtered and orphaned and maimed, and it happens in so many places in the world. And it's easy. I think many people would, if you ask them, you say, are you in favor of kids getting harmed like that? And most decent people would say no. And I think they would mean it. But ultimately, we are tribal people, and we do kind of look to ourselves and our own well-being first. So for the most part, it's like, well, I feel bad, but that's happening over there to those people that probably look a bit different from me and think a bit different from me. So it's not really it doesn't really have my central focus right now. And you mentioned earlier public choice theory, which is basically just shorthand for people who are going to pursue their own incentives. And it doesn't necessarily mean money. It could mean politicians trying to win office. And I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Findlay, who wrote, They Dare to Speak Out years ago, and how
behind me, yeah.
Sure, and how difficult it is, at least in terms of, for instance, Middle East policy, to do anything other than what Israel demands of us, what Zionists here at home demand of us, because they have so much influence in American politics and have conflated that what's good for Israel equals the United States. And, again, I don't mean to focus on Israel. It's just something that I've been looking at recently. But all of this said, all of these horrors that happen to all these people, what can be done about it? Because as far as I see, as long as the costs are distributed or down the road in terms of borrowing or inflation, people are going to more or less keep voting for politicians that endorse this sort of thing, because even if they oppose it, it's like, well, that's not my number one issue. My number one issue is I'm getting taxed. My
Great
property
point.
Taxes are going up. I have to make car payments. I lost my job. What can be done? Is Bitcoin an answer? If so, do things have to get a lot worse before they get better, at the risk of blackpilling you here? I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but it just seems we could all have these convictions that this is all really bad, and many people agree with us, but nothing seems to change unless something more fundamental changes.
Yeah. Well, look, this is already happening to a much greater extent on the left and inside the Democratic Party, but it's happening on the right as well, as this crack up over Israel. How can you be America first and Israel first? And particularly if you know the first thing about it, then you know that America's enemies are the bin Ladenites, the absolute most radical edge of Sunni Islam, who are essentially resentful subjects of America's kept, client regimes over there. Whereas the Israelis' enemies are the Iranians and now the Iraqis, because America listened to them and got rid of Saddam Hussein, and for the Iranians and their best friends. And their enemies are Hezbollah and the Alawites in Syria. And these are people never done any harm to the United States at all. I mean, the sort of proto-Hezbollah that blew up the barracks in 1983. But then again, the Israelis knew that attack was coming and refused to warn us. So that one's sort of a wash. And Hezbollah was a reaction to the Israeli invasion and occupation of Lebanon in the first place, which they shouldn't have been doing at all. And Ronald Reagan regretted putting those Marines there and pulled the rest of them out after that instead of doubling down, because he recognized his mistake in intervening in that war at all, especially on the side of the Israelis there. I don't know if he knew about their treachery on that bombing or not, but it's in By Way of Deception by Victor Ostrovsky, if people want a footnote for that. That's what they get for sticking their nose in, the Israelis said about the Americans at the Beirut bombing. But anyway, look, I'm not saying we should back Hezbollah against al-Qaeda, but I'm saying when Hezbollah is killing al-Qaeda, I'm rooting for Hezbollah against al-Qaeda because it was al-Qaeda that knocked our towers down and killed 3,000 of our people. And for that matter, it was al-Qaeda that was the bleeding edge, the vanguard of the Sunni-based insurgency in Iraq War II that killed 4,000 out of the 4,500 of American soldiers who died in that war. And the other 500, they always embellish to 600, and they always say we're killed by Iran, but that's a damn lie. They were killed by Iraqi Shiites because America picked a fight with one part of the same Shiite faction that they were fighting the whole war to install in power. United Iraqi Alliance, which was 1/3 made up of Muqtada al-Sadr and his men. And when David Petraeus picked a fight with him at Dick Cheney's insistence, it didn't work out so well, and a bunch of our guys died. That wasn't Iran that did that. It was David Petraeus who killed those boys for nothing. But anyway, the 4,000 of them died fighting the Sunni insurgency on behalf of those Shiites, and it was al-Qaeda in Iraq that was the bleeding edge of that, the same group that Obama later turned into the goddamn caliphate by taking their side, because that was what Israel wanted. Was America to take the side of the bin Ladenites in Syria. Last time, around 10 years ago, it blew up into the caliphate that conquered all of eastern Syria and western Iraq. Then we had to launch Iraq War III to destroy it again. This time, only just in December, al-Qaeda went west and sacked Damascus and succeeded in a full regime change against Israel's enemies, the Alawites, the friends of the Iranian Shiites and Hezbollah. So there is an absolute bifurcation in America's interests and theirs. They say, oh, well, them Islams over there in Arab land and all them towel heads and camel jockeys and these kinds of, don't you differentiate between actually who's who over there? Because you'll find that Israel has America fighting on the side of our enemies against people who should be at least the enemy of our enemies, if not our friends. And I'm not saying they should be our friends. Screw Hezbollah and Iran and the rest of them. But notably, Iran, after the revolution in 1979, Israel stayed friends with Iran. When America supported Saddam Hussein against Iran all through the 1980s, Israel stayed friends with Iran. That was why when Reagan switched sides for a time and sold weapons to Iran, he used the Israelis as the cutout. You give them some tow missiles and I'll give you some more, right? Was the whole thing. Well, that policy didn't end until 1993, Bill Clinton's first year in office, when Yitzhak Rabin decided he wanted to scapegoat Iran so that he could cozy up to the Sunnis on the closer countries and make a deal with the Palestinians. And then so that was when he turned on Iran. And at that point was when the Americans were ready to warm up relations with Iran. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been the national security advisor under Jimmy Carter when they were completely humiliated by the Iranian Revolution turning against them and seizing the hostages and all of that stuff. They originally had supported it in the early part of 79. It had only turned against them into the hostage crisis that November. But Brzezinski, who had been humiliated by the Ayatollah, by 93 said, you know what we should do? We should build a new pipeline from Azerbaijan through Iran to the Persian Gulf, and that'll be the start of warming up relations with Iran again and bringing them in from the cold after our recent contrebs. That was Bill Clinton's first year in office. And then what happened? The phony assassination attempt against George H.W. Bush, which was just a whiskey smuggling ring that the Kuwaitis embellished into an attack against H.W. Bush, which was the final straw for Bill Clinton capitulating to the Israel lobby in the form of Martin Indyk, who had been an advisor to Yitzhak Shamir and who had founded the Washington Institute for Near East Policy as a breakoff of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and inaugurated his doctrine of dual containment, which he announced in a speech at WINEP. And that meant since America, with Israeli encouragement, had just smashed the hell out of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq War I, well, now Saddam's not powerful enough to balance against Iran anymore. So now, and even though the Americans want to get along with Iran, so it doesn't matter, nope, America has to stay in Saudi to dual contain Iraq and Iran both. And then, of course, the staying in Saudi is what motivated the bin Ladenites that America supported in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya to then turn against the United States and knock our towers down in the first place. So, in other words, Israel's interests are absolutely opposite the interests of the American people and the American state. But now look at it from their point of view. If you're running Israel, there is no issue more important than your influence in Washington, D.C.
Of course.
You need the empire
Yeah.
to protect you at all times. And so they'll do anything. It is their absolute highest priority above every other thing in the world. Not that they don't mind stealing our, high-tech military schematics and selling them to the Chinese, or that kind of thing. They'll take any risk. They'll,
They'll try and
better
sink
to
some
ask
ships.
for forgiveness than permission, they say, They'll stab us in the back over and over again. And as Benjamin Netanyahu said on candid camera, oh, don't worry about the Americans. America is a thing that is easily moved. He said, 80% of them support us. It's absurd. He said, mocking the American people for being so stupid as to let this crappy little country that doesn't even have any oil or serve American interests in any way whatsoever lead us all around by the nose. And the conversation was about how he had sexually assaulted Bill Clinton right in the face and completely got away with it. He said, oh yeah, I told Bill Clinton, don't worry, I just need, this military zone of Area C. But then guess what? I get to define what's the military zone. And so I say it's every bit of all whatever I draw here on the West Bank, far more than enough to preclude the possibility of a Palestinian state on the West Bank forever. Right as I was looking Bill Clinton in the eye and telling him, of course, Mr. President, whatever you say, man, and completely screwing him over. And of course, and we know because they bragged about it. It's in the Israeli press. You can look it up right now that the Israelis were tapping Bill Clinton's phone and they were blackmailing him because they knew about his phone sex with Monica Lewinsky and could prove it. And this was before Linda Tripp and the whole scandal had broken. The Israelis had it. And so this was a big part of how they helped ruin the, implementing, I guess, the agreement at Y River and the rest that was supposed to go into effect by, to complete Oslo by the end of his presidency. And that was a big part of how they ruined it. And it just goes to show, right? And then what did Bill Clinton do, right? He was just like, well, whatever, keep them coming, and ends up, spending the weekend at Epstein Island raping, hopefully just teenagers and not actual small children.
Statutory rape. Thank you very much, Scott.
Yeah. I mean, that's who Bill Clinton is. So he's pretty easy to blackmail. And Netanyahu, and I encourage everybody to watch it. You can just look up. It's easy to find on YouTube with proper subtitles. The video, what happened was he's in a settler's house in a living room on the West Bank, and he's out of power at the time. I guess Ehud Olmert or maybe Sharon is in, it's Sharon is in because it's early 2000s. And he says, hey, kid, turn off the video camera. And the kid either deliberately leaves it on, or he accidentally hits the button twice or hits the wrong button, maybe just zooms in a little and the camera keeps rolling. And Netanyahu starts talking much more openly about how he's getting away with murder here. And that's where he mocks us all as being absurd for supporting his government and describing how he screwed over Bill Clinton. And then it's the Israeli press that got their hands on the tape and published it with all their subtitles and whatever. You can read it and weep, man. I don't know what to tell you. That's how the Israeli government deals with the United States. There's a couple of great anecdotes along these lines where I forget the source for this, but I'm sure you can find it, where when Bill Clinton first met Netanyahu, because he was in his first time in 1996, and he came to town to meet Bill Clinton. And after a half-hour meeting, Bill Clinton came out completely, they say, exasperated, like out of breath, and said, who in the fuck does this guy think he is? Oh my God, who's the superpower and who's the client state? So you can only imagine what it took for Bill Clinton to exclaim that after this meeting, right? Was Netanyahu talking to him like he's the butler. Here's your marching orders, Bill, right? And Clinton just couldn't believe it. And, you know, he'd just been, or I guess was about to be, safely reelected, right? And considered himself to be the king of the world, which he basically was, only to find out that actually, no, he works for these guys, apparently. And there's another one that was a hot mic moment where Barack Obama got caught talking with Nicolas Sarkozy, and Sarkozy saying, I can't stand it anymore, this guy. And Obama says, you think you hate him. I got to deal with him every day. Right? It's the only time I've ever felt any sympathy for Barack Obama in my entire life. Like, oh man, that would really suck. Can you imagine you get elected to be president of the United States? It's almost like my same sympathy for Trump. I'm not really a Trump guy, but imagine you get elected president and then the CIA and FBI frame you for treason and pretend to investigate you for 3 years and just destroy your entire presidency, right? It's the same thing with Obama. Imagine you get elected president of the United States, but then like 1 month before the election, Netanyahu wins the prime ministership back, and you're going to be stuck with him for 8 years. Yeah. I mean, I probably would have said in my inaugural address, I demand the people of Israel hold new elections and get rid of this guy. I'm not going to deal with them. Just, in fact, what you should do is probably you should just kill him. And so he's not going to be a problem for anyone anymore in the future. You could exile him to Elba, but he's going to try to come back. And we should just call an end to Netanyahu and his line and see if we can, you know, move on without him. That would have been my inaugural address had I been Barack Obama, you understand.
Disclaimer, Bitcoin Mentor and BT Sessions do not endorse the killing of anybody ever.
Oh no, of course not. But we're just talking about what the sovereign state of Israel can do, and they can apparently kill anyone that they want, including little babies and anything else. It's blood libel to say so, and yet they do it all day, every single day. And so certainly they could do it to the most dangerous man in the world, the leader of their own criminal regime. I'll leave that to them, though. I'll leave that to the War Crimes Tribunal.
Is there an answer to this? I mean, is there a way that we, at the risk of... I was going to say, so right-wingers are sick of it. Look, here's my anecdote from last night. We ran an article at the Libertarian Institute that's about how the Israel lobby's already declared war against Thomas Massie. Why? Is Thomas Massie against Israel? No, he's just not for them. He doesn't want to subsidize them anymore, support their wars anymore. And so they're declaring holy jihad, and they're going to do everything they can. If he runs for Senate, the Republican Jewish coalition already announced they have unlimited funds to pour into his race to prevent him from becoming a U.S. senator. And I tweeted that article out, and it's the most liked and most retweeted thing I've ever tweeted.
Wow.
It's I'm almost certain of that. And the reaction, you know, there's some pretty scummy reaction that you would regret, but there's a lot of people who are just flabbergasted and astounded. They just can't believe that that they would be so blatant to say that unless this man starts serving the interests of a foreign power right now, we will destroy his political career, no matter what, Israel first, in such a blatant way. And for people who've just been sold America first and we want peace, Trump didn't just run on ending the war in Ukraine. He ran on no more wars and have at least 4 years of no new wars and take the ones that we've got and ramp them down and bring them to an end. And he wants, for his own sake, maybe, 4 years at least of peace and prosperity and something to brag about and be remembered by, and not just, you know, committing these horrible acts. So he ran on that, and his people believe him. Now, you and I and people paying close attention know he's always been avowedly Zionist and has always been the worst on Zionism, is absolutely worst thing. And he did run on that, quite frankly, but he didn't run on doing whatever Israel says, and especially keeping wars going on behalf of Israel and deferring to Israel in all cases and all of these things, the way that's happened. And you can see the shock among the MAGA right when he says, yeah, we're taking full responsibility for the Gaza Strip. And they're going, what? Immediately they're going, what? Now, the smear artists will say that anyone, especially on the right, but I guess anyone who disagrees with Israel at all is a vicious Jew-hating anti-Semite. But it's just not true. You're talking about a bunch of people who loved Israel the day before yesterday, but they just can't see why America is supposed to take a back seat to this foreign country. Why is that the standard for everything? It just makes no sense. It truly makes no sense, right? It's sort of the same thing with turning against the war in Afghanistan. You might really be a flag-waving patriot who says, we just got to beat them terrorists. Then, one day in August, it occurs to you that, man, this is just stupid. What are we doing? We're going to pacify the Pashtuns? Nobody's seen an Arab in Afghanistan in 16 years. What in the world are we still doing? Now, once that finally gets through your thick skull, you're never going back again to, I got to support that Afghan war some more. No, you're cured of it. It's the same thing here. Why in the world should America consider Hezbollah to be a worse enemy than Al-Qaeda? Because Israel says so? It wasn't Hezbollah that knocked our towers down. That's the standard. Who knocked our towers down? And it wasn't Israel's enemies. It was ours, Israel's allies. And so, and by the way, you can read in the Wall Street Journal today that Israel is now worried that they helped put Al-Qaeda in power in Damascus and say, oh no, we need the rest of the world to promise to keep these guys in check. We're so happy we got rid of the Alawite friends of the Shiites. But now that we got the bin Ladenites in there, these guys could be trouble, which may be just PR. It depends on how much the Israelis are giving them of American tax money at any given moment. But the answer to your question is that it is, again, with Joe Biden and the elderly age thing here, things that are just too apparent to ignore. Things that are just too wrong to think are okay. And, if you see, libs of TikTok and Bari Weiss and the Insurrection Barbie and all of these like most prominent right-wing influencers who, isn't it just apparent? Like at some point you follow them for a little while and you realize this whole thing is just an Israeli op. Oh, I get it. You corner the market on anti-woke. But anyone who disagrees with you is an anti-Semite, huh? I see how this works, right? This is just right-wing woke to prevent people and to corral and say only leftists oppose Israel. All good right-wingers who are opposed to chopping little boys' parts off in the name of the trans agenda are all right-wing Zionists, right, everybody? And yet, but that's completely stupid and wrong. And why would
just pacing and leading?
That? And especially when at the heart of woke is you're an anti-Semite. How dare you ever contradict Israel? Which is no different than saying you just hate black people or you just hate trans people every time you contradict the woke on the left. Nobody's buying that stuff anymore. And people like Insurrection Barbie, whoever that is, are becoming more and more transparent. You may have seen where Tucker Carlson just says, Bari Weiss is an op. Bari Weiss doesn't care about anything except fooling right-wingers into being pro-Israel. And in his case, what he said was getting right-wingers to support attacking Iran. But that's what that means.
One and the same.
Supporting Israel, fighting the Shiites at the expense of the American people. That is who Bari Weiss is. She's an op. And by the way, I'm so glad I looked this up again this morning because I had ranted about this before and I saw where someone questioned me. I can't find it. And I went to find it and I couldn't find it either. And I couldn't remember my footnote and I was all pissed off. So I looked it up again and I found it again this morning, guys. Of course, my stupid memory. I should have remembered. Here's your keyword.
Stupid memory? You're a bloody encyclopedia.
Well, I forget more than I remember. Here's your keywords: kittens and donuts. Okay, so there's this. It was a suppressed Al Jazeera documentary that was done undercover. They got an American Jew or a British Jew to go undercover with the Israel lobby and get secret footage of them being just absolutely horrible. It's really fantastic journalism. I mean, really top of the line stuff. Clayton Swisher is the journalist who's behind it. And it's a two-part thing. It's called The Lobby for Al Jazeera. And part of it is on the United States and part of it is on Britain. I think maybe Britain is part one and the United States is part two. But here's the thing about it, and you won't be surprised at all, but like it just makes perfect sense. And then, but you won't ever forget it. The Israeli Foreign Ministry set up a sock puppet account on Facebook, 100 more similar to it. And this one was called Kittens and Donuts. And what it was they would post pictures of kittens and donuts. Doesn't everybody like kittens and donuts? And so the whole thing was geared around bringing essentially progressive and liberal housewives, right, into this community of people. And they would post inspiring quotes by Maya Angelou or whatever type, liberal fare that people like. And here's a little kitten and here's a donut. And it's this constant stream of stuff. And then, like, whatever the time is, I'm making this up, but for the point, every 6 weeks or so, here's a pink F-16 because Israel's over there fighting for gay rights, everybody, or whatever it was, right? And so they spike it with this pro-Israel propaganda. But then there's a million more like that. There's a billion more like that. And then that's the same thing as libs of TikTok. That's the same thing as Ben Shapiro and Bari Weiss and Insurrection Barbie on the right. That's all they are. That's what Ben Shapiro is. He's kittens and donuts. So he gets out there and he says, here's some right-wing economic theory. And he gets out there and he says, here's some why you shouldn't cut your son's parts off and turn him into a girl. And
I'm with you so far. That sounds good so far.
That's right. And now here's why you have to support Israel.
Yeah.
To be a good right-winger. Otherwise, you're some kind of left-wing college communist.
Yeah.
Right? That's all he is. He's kittens and donuts. He's not even a person. And I don't mean like he's a subhuman. I just mean he's a psyop. Right? He is an act. And it's the same thing. You look at libs of TikTok, and it's like, oh, I like that one. I like that one. I like that one. Oh, Israel can kill whatever babies they want to. I see what this is about.
I was going to say, there's a lot of stuff on libs and TikTok that I do like, but
Same thing with the Babylon Bee.
Sure.
Same thing with the Babylon Bee. They'll go, oh, really good joke, really good joke, really good joke. Oh, Hamas demands that all Jews kill themselves. Oh, yeah, hilarious. Boy, you got me on that one. Look at me. I'm a Zionist now, Babylon Bee. You're so convincing with your complete ridiculous crap. But that's what it is. And it's, as they say, flood the zone with it. But then isn't it doesn't it get to the point? It's like watching CNN. Like, I'm sorry, like Bill Hicks. I see through you. I don't know what to say. Like, this doesn't work anymore. I see libs of TikTok for what it is. It's an Israeli sock account. It's just kittens and donuts. And so once you've got that in your system, how are you going to ever believe in supporting the war in Afghanistan again? How are you ever going to believe in Joe Biden's capacity again? How are you ever going to believe in Israeli propaganda about why Americans ought to hate all their enemies whose land they want to steal again? Insurrection Barbie had a thing last week where she says, oh, yeah, we got to protect the Christians of Palestine. Well, who's killing the Christians of Palestine? She would lead her audience to believe that it's Hamas that threatens the Christians of Palestine, but that's not true. And no one who knows anything about it at all believes that that's true. And so, of course, she gets absolutely murderlated in the comments section. Same thing happened yesterday. She said, oh, look, LOL. Here's the list of the countries that spend the most on lobbying the United States, and Israel's down at the bottom. And then every single comment says, yeah, but everybody knows that AIPAC doesn't have to register as a foreign agent, nor does the American Jewish Federation and whatever. There's 1,000 of them. None of them have to register as a foreign lobby because they're the ones who wrote all the loopholes. And they say, no, we're just Americans who support Israel. Nothing foreign about it at all. We're just local grassroots phenomenon. And so everybody knows that. And everyone can see right through Insurrection Barbie for the Israeli Foreign Ministry sock puppet plant that she is. That's why they call it Hasbara, is because it's bullshit. Israel has to lie to you to get you to agree with the things that they do and say. And I'll end with this. And again, and there's the answer to your question is people are just seeing through it. So it's going to come to simply a fight between the donors and the voters on both halves, on the right and the left. Where the voters of America are sick and tired of this, the supporters, the progressives and the MAGA guys, everybody's sick and tired of this, but the billionaires who control both political parties insist. And so there's a big crack up coming on both halves of the political spectrum there, for sure. But for anyone skeptical of what I'm saying about just how absolutely absurdly dishonest the Israelis are, I urge you to go and read. Everybody knows who Frank Luntz is, right? The Republican pollster.
He used to have really
News.
bad teeth, but yes, I know who he is.
Yeah, bad guy. I'm no one to talk about that. But so Frank Luntz did a thing called the Israel Project, the Global Language Dictionary. is what it's called. It's from 2008, 2009. Frank Lunt's Global Language Dictionary. And I'll really beseech your audience, and you guys both, if you haven't, to take a real good look at this thing. And what it is they spent a lot of money bringing together focus groups from all around the United States and did a real study of what do you have to tell Americans to get them to support Zionism. And the conclusion is you have to lie to them about everything, because Israel is the aggressor and everything they do is a deadly sin straight out of the Bible, coveting and stealing and murdering, like the supreme creator of the entire universe commanded them especially and everybody else not to do. But anyway, and so you got to lie. And so you have to say, I know it is an apartheid state. Isn't it terrible? Why won't the Palestinians just let the Jews live wherever they want? And they just turn everything upside down. And make the Israelis the victims, because the truth sucks. And they admit in there, look, we can't really talk about what's happening. So we have to sort of spin it, it's all in there. And they urge people to say, oh, I know. Yes, we're all very, very concerned about the Palestinians' humanitarian well-being. Don't you think that the real problem is Palestinian leadership? Right? They get you to practice how to say everything, how to feign empathy for the poor Palestinians before you explain why it's all their fault that they're being treated this way on the land where their actual grandfathers are from, unlike the Israelis, who are, in their leadership cast, a bunch of transplants from Eastern Europe who have no claim to that land whatsoever. I thought it was funny, a map of where Israel's various prime ministers were born in their history.
Seen this,
It's a map of Eastern Europe, and they have little spots all over Eastern Europe where all these people were born, in Poland and Ukraine and in Austria, Hungary, and whatever the hell. None of them in Palestine. None of them. Because that's not where they're from. They're from somewhere else. It's the Palestinians who are the ones who are the victims of their aggression, plain and simple. And people always get upset. Oh, so you love Hamas, you love terrorism, whatever. But victimhood doesn't require perfection on the part of the aggrieved.
No, and it doesn't require binary thinking either. Just because one
doesn't.
is bad doesn't mean the other is good, and vice versa.
Yeah, I can hit all
right.
states equally.
And the question is, who's the aggressor? And the answer is the Israelis are the aggressors and the Palestinians are their pathetic, beaten victims. Simple as that, And no offense to them for it. But, when we talk about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, people got to understand this ain't Palestine. If you don't know much about it, people talk about the Palestinians. It sounds like they're from a country called Palestine because everybody's got a country, right? But no, Palestine is where Israel's sitting right now, is what was Palestine. They stole it. So the Palestinians now live in what are occupied territories. It's not the country next door at all. Contra Ben Shapiro, who likes to bring up these ridiculous comparisons to, well, what would we do if Mexico was attacking us across the Rio Grande, implying the nation state in Mexico City and its armed military force attacking the United States of America. But that's not the analogy at all. That analogy is inapt, and he, again, is just kittens and donuts, a damn liar here to fool you. When in fact, the apt analogy would be, what if America built a giant wall around the Navajo reservation out in Arizona and continued to bomb them and bomb them and bomb them and kill their people and steal their stuff unrelentingly, refusing to ever stop picking on the Navajo and seizing every last bit of their territory for them in the name of manifest destiny. That's your comparison. And then you see who's the aggressor and who's not the aggressor. It is black and white. And it doesn't matter whether anyone inside that wall ever scalped somebody or not. The Americans still are the aggressors in that situation, just exactly the same as the Israelis are the aggressors in Palestine. It is as simple as that.
Are you still keeping your Bitcoin on the exchange? Are you confident in your current Bitcoin setup? At Bitcoin Mentor, we've helped hundreds of people level up their security and fast-track their Bitcoin understanding. If you find that you simply don't have time to go through all the tutorials, the books, and the guides, you can book a free strategy session with me by simply scanning the QR code or clicking the link in the description down below. Discover how Ben, Gary, myself, the entire expert team at Bitcoin Mentor can help you accelerate your Bitcoin journey. Simply scan the QR code or head to bitcoinmentor.io to learn more about how we can help you.
Nate, I'm going to leave this to you. You want to close it out?
The hard thing is I don't want to close it out. There's so many things
I don't
about
either,
as well,
but
too.
we're like an hour and a half in. I'm sure you have stuff to do. I'd be fine releasing like a 17-hour podcast, which I'm sure you could stay up for, Scott, with like a couple cups of coffee. But I don't think our listeners are ready for
this
it.
morning, boys. But yeah, I probably should go.
Okay, I'll get a couple things in there quick. So I did want to touch on one thing as well too, and then we'll move to wrap it up. One, I want to comment on the fact that I think you're absolutely right that we're seeing this shift in the Overton window, and it is kind of all aligning with like libertarian Austrian thinking, including on war. Right, we're starting to see people question like the USAID, the funds going to foreign nations. We're starting to see like, hey, should we be sending additional supplies to Ukraine, to Israel? Like, is this in our interest? And they're starting to question that. And just like at least for us and with Bitcoin as well, once you see it, you can't unsee it. There's no going back. The propaganda doesn't work anymore, right? You're only susceptible to propaganda that you agree with. And from that point, we're seeing that the rise in inflation and the hardships that we're experiencing economically, all aligning with then all this push for additional military. It's all coming to the point people are starting to question, do I actually have any benefit? Not necessarily in like the U.S. as a nation state, but the U.S. empire expansion, all that additional shit going on around the world. And I think you're right. I think we're moving in the right direction. And hopefully we can continue to bring people in that fold and let them see, and hopefully they can understand, like, you're being screwed, you're being stolen from. Yeah, people are being killed and maimed and destroyed as a result of this. There's no gain for you. It's all loss, whether it be economic or even just like spiritual or just human life.
Yep.
So I wanted to get that out there, which was just me saying, I agree, but I just really wanted to throw that out there. The one thing I did want to touch on, and you might not have anything, but I needed to ask this as well too. Anytime I hear you speak, the podcast, the books, everything, you come with just an absolute wealth of knowledge, and you bring receipts for everything, right? Here's the quote here. It was said, and the dates and everything as well too. Is there anything that you don't have receipts for at this point? Either that's something that may have happened or may be going on, but you suspect may be happening?
I'll always be obsessed with the Oklahoma City bombing and what was the real motivation of the men behind it. I know there were a lot of neo-Nazis involved who were essentially just undercover FBI informants and state's witnesses who, by virtue of that fact, had compromised their FBI agent handlers right back. So then when they were the ones who did the bombing, that gave the FBI the incentive to let them all go free, which they did. But there are also questions about agents provocateur who helped create that bombing in the first place, and people who had ties to Central Intelligence and to foreign intelligence agencies. Andre Karl Strassmeyer, who was, almost virtually certainly one of the ringleaders and inspirations for McVeigh and the rest to carry out the attack, was a German, an army intelligence officer, and who had some ties to Israel. And there's suspicions, and he was also working with what's known as the Southern Poverty Law Center, which specialized in smearing, any kind of right-wing group outside of the Republican Party, especially in that era, and had close ties to Israel. And Morris Dees, we know, was helping to run Andre Strassmeyer for the FBI and whoever else at that time. So I think, it's a bit uncertain. I used to be much more comfortable way back then in just saying, oh, of course, the government did this to essentially frame the right for it and all of that. But I really don't think that's the case. They're going to blow up a daycare of their own employees' babies just for the PR stunt. But I think they'd risk it. I think the point was to try to do a sting and prevent the thing from happening and then be heroes and demonize the right just the same. And then what happened was the Nazis got a second Ryder truck and just the tracker was on the other one, and they got away with doing it under the cop's very nose. So this is something where, my guy Richard Booth is the world's greatest expert on this. And we have an archive at libertarianinstitute.org/OKC that is only the best stuff, no kooky stuff. It is somewhat of a conspiracy type topic, so there's a lot of smoke that people have blown about it, but not Richard Booth. He is only 100% right on, highest journalistic standards for his take on this. And we have all firsthand government documents and court records and so forth, as well as all the best journalism and everything there at libertarianinstitute.org/OKC. So that's one that's, somewhat solved, but not completely, in that, I'll always want to know the full story of what really happened there.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you, Scott. And with that, please tell us, where can people go and find your work? Which books should they be checking out? Tell us more about the Libertarian Institute, everywhere that they need to go and check out after this podcast.
Sure. Thank you. So I got a show. I've done 6,000 interviews and more since 2003. That's all at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. I have I've written 3 books and published 2 more that are transcripts of my interviews. But the 3 I've written are Fool's Errand about Afghanistan, Enough Already about all the terror wars, and then most recently Provoked, how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. You mentioned I put out already audiobooks of Fool's Errand and Enough Already. I'm now working on the audiobook of Provoked. I'm doing it in sections in the Martyr Made style there on Substack, and that's scotthortonshow.com or at patreon.com/scotthortonshow. And I've already put out the H.W. Bush chapter and about half of Bill Clinton, which is like more than 3 hours long for the first half of Clinton there, or maybe first third of it. It's a long book. And then let's see. Oh, and I'm the editorial director of the most important project on the internet, which is antiwar.com. That's Dave DeCamp and Eric Garris and Kyle Anzalone and the guys putting together all of the worst bad news for you every single day, and of the highest quality caretaking as well, and all the best viewpoints. And then I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute. Sorry for so many things, but
you're a busy guy.
I'm the director of the Institute, the Libertarian Institute, and I got about 25 of the best writers and authors and podcasters in the entire libertarian movement you can find anywhere. I'm confident that we're second best after Mises. I don't mind, giving them the top spot. They've certainly earned it. But we're second best after Mises there. We published 16 books so far. We got an absolute ton of great guys. And just look at the articles on the front page at libertarianinstitute.org right now. They absolutely knock your socks off. All of them are absolutely fantastic stuff. As I always said about my radio show, I'm not the most talented broadcaster, but I've got an excellent taste in guests. And it's the same thing with the team I put together at the Institute. And right now it's our fundraising time. So this is particularly for you Bitcoin millionaires out there who've already done so well, betting against inflation here with your Bitcoin. We have $25,000 worth of matching funds to promise right now. We have books and tote bags and audiobooks and all kinds of cool stuff to give as kickbacks. And of course, you can write it off on your income taxes as a 501c3 organization. That's all at libertarianinstitute.org/donate right now. And I sure would appreciate it if you guys can help me pay my guys. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you both very much for having me.
Of course. And when does that fundraiser end?
As soon as we raise $60,000.
Okay. All right.
If you enjoyed this interview with Scott Horton, please do like, share, and subscribe.